You're listening to the Tony Steuer Podcast, where Tony interviews financial literacy advocates who are changing the conversation on money, so you can catch up on the latest trends and ideas in the world of financial literacy and education.
Welcome to the Tony Steuer Podcast. I'm pleased to be joined today by Diana Yanez. Diana is a financial empowerment guide at all the colors. In this episode, we'll be discussing how to feel confident in your money decisions. Welcome to the Tony Steuer Podcast, Diana.
Thank you, Tony. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you on. So, I always like to get started with people at the beginning. Can you share with us, what is your origin story? How did you get started in financial wellness?
I originally worked in financial services industry when I was in college. So I spent a little bit over a year at Merrill Lynch, which is a broker-dealer. And while I was there in 2008. So right when the bottom was falling out of the investment world is when I was there. And I left that experience thinking financial services is not for me. And a decade later, fast forward a decade later, here I am coming back into the financial services industry. That time I went back working at an RIA, having passed the CFP exam and on my way to becoming a certified financial planner. Once I had the experience, once I met the experience requirement. And what took me from thinking the financial services industry is not for me to finally coming back was learning more about other ways that people worked with money, right? It wasn't just about asset gathering. There was also a lot more focus on making sure that your values were being represented in your money and that you were using money to live into your best life.
Yeah, well, that's great. And I think that's so important is that, it's easy to look at those superficial things. And when you come into a traditional avenue like Merrill Lynch or any of the big firms, is you tend to get that product focus first. So, it's great. I think this is the future. And I know you talk a lot about this, is about why we do what we do. Can you share with us, why is it important to go deeper into why we do what we do?
Yeah, I love the focus on financial literacy. It's really important to understand, what is a stock? What is a bond? How does insurance work? The information is really helpful. Yet we don't actually implement those recommendations unless we're very clear on our vision and on our beliefs. I like to compare it to food, right? So we all know that the recommendation is that you should eat 50% of your plate should be veggies, 25% should be protein, the other 25% should be carb. But in a given meal, it's rare that our meals actually look that clean. Right. So we might know what to do, but implementing it is a different part. So I like to focus on that gap between knowing what to do and actually doing it.
Yeah, well, I think that's important is, that's something I've mentioned with financial literacy as well, is that, it's great to teach somebody what a 401k is, but you have to show them how to put it into action. It's like you talk about with diet. It's easy to say that, but when you go into a restaurant and vegetables may not be an option, sometimes it's how do you make that adjustment? Because maybe financial services, insurance is maybe your vegetables. Nobody wants to eat their vegetables or get their insurance, but it's important.
Well, and I also like to focus on why it's important that you do it. And one of the, when I work with community, I'm Latina. And one of the things that happens very often with Latinos, I remember finding this at the Population Reference Bureau. They were doing research, and one of the beliefs that they had was why plan for tomorrow, right? When there's a cultural narrative of I can't really plan for the future, I don't know what's going to happen. It makes it really hard to show people, to tell people, to have them see that saving for retirement is in their best interest, right? So I like to get at that narrative, what is the reason that you may know intellectually what to do, but you're not doing it?
Yeah, I think that's really deep. And I think that's a challenge we've had in the financial services world is that, people know they need to, spend less money than they earn. They know they need to save money for retirement. That's not really the issue. I mean, obviously providing the educational tools are the issue, but it's like, how do we change your behavior? And I think what one of the things you mentioned is that it is a cultural issue. Is that different cultures are going to have different whys, for doing those things. So it's really exciting that you're doing that kind of work. So one of the things you also talk about is, owning your power. So how can you own your power with money?
Yeah. And that really depends on each person's situation, right? One of the first things that I always, whenever I'm working with someone, either one-on-one or in a group environment, it's getting clarity on your beliefs around money.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. One of the people at Morningstar, I'm blanking out on her name right now. I'm so sorry, Doctor.
Oh,
But she talks about.
I know you're talking about.
You know who it is? Yeah, Sarah. Oh, I can't remember.
Bernhard? No, it's not Bernhard. It starts with a B, right?
I think it starts with a B. Yes. And she's done this research on confidence and how important it is to have financial confidence. And I like to think of it as like owning your power, like thinking like no matter what the financial situation, I know that I have what it takes to move through it, to get through it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been a bigger predictor of financial well-being than income. And then assets, right? Because I worked with clients who had a lot of assets and they still felt nervous, right?
Mm-hmm.
They still felt like something could go wrong. Even when they had a Monte Carlo of like 103%, they were still like,
Mm-hmm.
what if the bottom falls out and Martians attack us? And that's more about confidence than it is about the actual numbers. Like money is rarely just about the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
So owning our power goes again back to like understanding your beliefs. And for communities that are historically oppressed, and honestly, that includes women, anyone who's neurotypical, LGBTQ+, people of color, it's really important that we have a very clear voice in many conversation. I always remind people, whenever you're going to work with a professional, if they speak to you in like a way that's very jargony, and you don't understand it, it's not on you. It's on
Mm-hmm.
them. Make it simple. Right. So those are
examples
in your power.
And I agree completely. And it gets, it's an expansion of what you're talking about with the culture is different people because of who they are, how they've grown up, whatever, have different access. To education, the language that they use with their peers are different. And the language of financial services is geared towards older white males because that's historically who's been running financial service companies. So there's, it's not necessarily good or bad, but it's what it is. And we have to change that. And we have to use words that speak to people who are differently abled. And I'm really glad you brought that up, is because people oftentimes, may focus, of course, there's cultural and gender gaps, but it's also that LGBTQIA gap. There's the disabled gap. Is disabled people really feel like they're left out of the conversation on this stuff. And they have the same struggles as well. So it's a deeper issue of basically, okay, how do we talk to somebody who's not like who we are? I think that's the underlying issue is, can you translate to someone else? And that's a rare talent.
It's a lot about listening, I think, because when we ask people like if I'm explaining something to someone, like let's say I'm talking about variable life insurance, right? To talk about something that's complicated. And it's easy for me to tell whether that person is engaged or not. I actually am a highly sensitive person. So which is about 20% of the population is highly sensitive. Like, and I can just tell when someone's not listening, I can tell that they're like, okay, they're off in la la land. And that skill helps me connect with the person and ask them like, well, what did you understand? What did you from what I said, and doing it always in a way that's not shaming them for not understanding it from the get-go. So one thing you could do is you can frame it like, these are really new concepts. And because let's say you're getting insurance because you just had a baby, right? So you're getting insurance, you're going through all of these so you would tell people you're going through all these life changes. It can be hard to learn new concepts, especially dry financial concepts. I just want to make sure that I'm being clear. Can you let me know what you heard? Right. So in that way,
I love that.
Yeah. And that way I'm taking ownership of the fact that me as a financial professional, I need to make it very clear to you of what's happening. And if it's not clear to you, it's not you, it's me.
I think that's important. And I think that also ties into the listening, because you're listening to what the client's hearing. And also they're going to tell you when you ask that kind of question, what they're not hearing. And I think that's also so important is what is the client not hearing from the message? So you may describe something like variable universal life, and then, and you got your 10 features that, most of us will talk about. But the client, even though you may cover, let's say, the death benefit and how it works, the client may not hear anything on it. And then they'll come back and they'll ask you a question. It's like, yeah, I heard that, it's got a cash value, but does it pay a death benefit? And, and your first response is like, okay, well, yeah, that was the first thing I said, but it may not process for the client because they may not know the terminology. They may not have, I don't want to say the background, that's not quite the right word, but the framework to process that word. And to put it into context. Context is what I was looking for. So I love that. I wrote that down in my notes, like in big letters. So I love capturing the ideas from people that I speak with. And I think, for those who are out there listening to this, I think that's a key question. Ask your clients and, people you talk with is, what did you just hear? Actually, it's good relationship advice too.
Any conversation that you're having, and yeah, it's definitely important to make sure that you're speaking the same language, that you're on the same page.
Yeah, and it gets towards what you were talking about earlier is bridging that cultural gap. It's a good way to bridge the cultural gap because you can see where the holes are in your communication. So that's awesome. Let's talk about values for a minute. Is you talk also about aligning your money with your values. So how does somebody do it? How do you align your money with your values?
Well, there was something I forgot to mention earlier, and that's connected to this values conversation. So most of us have our money personalities, the way that we think about money, what we do with money, that's developed by the time we're about 6 or 7 years old, right? That's from research from Dr. Lutz. Luutz. I do remember her name.
Okay.
And that's incredible to think, right? That by the time we're 7, we already kind of have a mindset around what money's for and how to use it. And a lot of the beliefs, we probably don't understand insurance, but we already have a money relationship. And as adults, when I'm working with people, my first priority is understanding their beliefs around money and understanding values. I have them do this values exercise. I have a bunch of lists. I have a list of values, and they go through and they circle them and they narrow it down to the top 5. So then they have top 5 values. Then we look at their cash flow. And literally, are your values in your cash flow? Right? You may not need to budget, but you still need to understand, for example, myself, one of my values is adventure. I love trying new things. I really love visiting new places. And when I was first out of college, I couldn't afford to travel the way that I am traveling now, but I still had adventure as part of my spending plan, as part of my values. So I made sure to once a month, go do something touristy in LA. I lived in Los Angeles. There were plenty of touristy things to do. And when clients understand their values, then it's easier for them to implement the financial plan recommendations when the financial plan recommendations are aligned with their values. Does that make sense? I think I'm using the word values so much that it might be difficult to follow.
No, that makes perfect sense. And, lately I've been thinking a lot about the relationship of the medical field to the financial field. And I think that sort of physician, know thyself first in order to heal yourself. And I think, if I'm hearing you correctly, to use some of your language from earlier, is that, if you understand who you are, then it's much more likely that you're going to have a more successful financial future, right?
Right, right. And one of your values is community. And then that makes it easier to like save for your kids' college because they're part of your community, right? So like that, and it putting our money relationships in context of our values is really, it really forces people to kind of take a step back and look at the bigger picture, because so much of the time, especially when clients are coming to me as a financial coach, they're in a lot of stress around money.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So by moving, like once we have a clarity on their beliefs, clarity on their values, then it's easier to come and start to move into the implementation.
Yeah, I think that it's so important is to understand somebody's values, because then they're going to be hopefully more satisfied with the recommendations, a year out, where they're going to say, okay, well, I understand at least why I did this. Is perhaps they may not be happy with the performance, but it's not going to be a question of the plan itself. And I think that's an important distinction for clients is, no matter whether you're selling a product, giving financial advice, is that, you have to make sure that your clients believe in the recommendations. And the best way to get them to believe in the recommendations is let them really be a part of the recommendations.
Help them.
So,
yeah. And a value, just to give a definition, is something that when you're not upholding it, there's a discrepancy in your life. There's dissonance. There's some kind of pain point that's created. Again, like I said, one of my values is adventure. So like I have to make sure that I'm always putting something into that bucket, and that I'm prioritizing not only my money, but also my time, right? If you really want to know what someone's values are or what they prioritize, let's look at how they spend their money and look at how they spend their time.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So there's so many things that you talk about that I couldn't wait to talk to you about. And, one of the other things, that you talk about is being a good ancestor. So, share with us, why is it important to be a good ancestor?
Yeah, so because I work with a lot of people from historically oppressed communities, and their beliefs and patterns, I ask them what they learned from their parents and what their parents might have learned from their grandparents, right? So and even just like myself as a woman, women in the US were not allowed to have credit cards in their name until 1974, right?
Yeah.
So
it's amazing.
It's amazing. It was 50 years ago, less than 50 years, 48 years ago. Like I would not have been able to go and get a credit card on my own. My brother would have had to like co-sign for me, or like, that's ridiculous. Like my neighbor, and becoming a good ancestor for me is seeing how my decisions today impact what's happening in the future. And I like to remind people of how their ancestors impacted them now, just to bring up the depth of power that they have in shaping what's going to happen for who's coming after them.
Yeah, no, I think that's important. And I think it's also important for people to understand too, is that, things in the future can hopefully continue to shift for the better. And, that there are lessons that you take from your ancestor, but it is, I think, also an opportunity to write a better future for your children. That you always have to respect history, but you don't have to be, I guess, tied by it, because, it's not fair some of the ways that people have been financially oppressed, and some of it still happens. There's definitely some racial and gender bias that still occurs. I mean, just look at the pay gap or the pink tax. I mean, we could go on about the different ways that there's gender bias in financial services. But as you point out, some things have changed in the last 50 years, and maybe it's not as much as should change. but it is something. And how do you make that next incremental change for your kids? And count that in your financial plan. That's a tricky thing. So, but I think it's really important for people to think about is, maybe it's role modeling for your kids, but even further down is, and that's in line with your values, because some people are going to care about this and other people, I'm just thinking of one client that I had early on, and, we were talking about his insurance planning, and, because, I want to take care of my wife, but not my kids. And I don't know if he was having a bad day with his kids or, but he was very clear that his kids were not part of his planning. And, it was his wife and it was nonprofits, and his kids were like completely out there. So I think, that's important, for people to understand what they want to accomplish and, what kind of legacy.
Were his kids in their 50s or were his kids in their 10 years old? Like how, because that makes sense.
they weren't little ones, because that'd be really bad if they were 5 years old. I think they were in their 30s. So, they were adult kids. So, there could be any reasons for that. But, it is, for him, being a good ancestor was not really an important factor. But I think most of us are, or maybe want to leave a positive legacy.
Or maybe he was trying to leave a legacy of independence. Maybe, who knows? Like, that's always really curious, because, and that's again why money is such an interesting field to work in, because I can look at someone's financial plan and think, oh, this is what it means about them. But then it's actually in talking to them that you hear the stories. As for myself, as a coach, I have to have a lot of self-awareness that I'm not bringing my stuff into the client's plan. And I wanted to mention that phrase, good ancestor, it actually comes from Lila Saad. And she wrote a book called Me and White Supremacy. So again, it's, if you look at my website at all the colors, you'll see that like social activism is really prevalent in there, because again, I serve people who want to be good ancestors.
Well, that's awesome. And I'm so glad that you're out there doing the work that you're doing. And, I think we want to make sure we have a minute to talk about your money community. What is the Bosque Money Community?
Yeah. So Bosque Money is a 6-month coaching program. And it's for people who have tried to figure out their money on their own. They read a book, they listen to a podcast, they signed up for an online class, and then they never got anywhere. Right? Because it can be hard to stay in this field of understanding what you're doing with money, because we can get so critical of ourselves. And it's a 6-month program, which we meet 11 times over those 6 months. The first 6 weeks we meet weekly, and we go a lot of the focus is on money beliefs and our money history. Where did we learn those beliefs? Where did they start to develop? And the idea is that once you understand where the beliefs came from and what need they were trying to serve, then it becomes easier to up-level them, to upgrade them. For example, I'll just use myself as an example. One of the beliefs that I grew up with as a child of immigrants is that I couldn't ask for more than what I had. I couldn't have more needs, because whenever I would go back to visit my family in Mexico, my cousins in Mexico, I saw how much more access I had, how much more privilege I had. And that belief then made me fear asking for more money or trying bigger opportunities, right? So I see how those incidents that happened when I was very young continue to repeat themselves in me. And then the work is to change them. And the way that I changed that is that we all get to have our needs met, right? Why was I, as an 8-year-old, feeling guilt over my privilege? It would be better if I just didn't have to worry about anybody not having their needs met. Right. So it's very collective. Yeah.
No, I like that. And I think it's hard because, there are people who are privileged but they want to help. And I think that something is, you can recognize that you're privileged, but the key is, are you going to do something from your position of privilege to help other people? And so, what would you say to people, who want to reach out to, somebody who's in an underserved population, underrepresented population? How can people start to change the way, they talk about money?
Yeah, I'm going to take a page from Fong Long. Her last name is Luong, and she talks a lot about understanding our financial history.
Mm-hmm.
Right, that's really important. So for those of us who are in the financial services industry, I really recommend reading The Color of Money by Marissa Baradaran. Her last name is pretty long, Baradaran.
Oh, that's good.
She's a professor at UC Irvine, my alma mater. She's a law professor there. And this book, The Color of Money, it's basically an economics textbook, but it talks about how systemic the racial wealth divide is. Even just reading that book and having that information, I believe will change the way that we approach underserved communities. There's a lot of very harmful narratives out there that, like, I got to where I am on my own, and sometimes it's true. But again, we have to look at the privilege that we have that facilitated us getting there, right? That book talks about the redlining that happened and how wealth was sequestered into white areas. It talks about a lot of systemic things that help us see, as individuals, there's a lot we can do, but yet when you're pitted up against a system that's oppressive, it's the system that needs to change.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, for people who are out there, listening to this episode, is, that this stuff is real. It's something, but you have to go deeper, as Diana points out. And I've been fortunate also to record an episode with Fong, and she talked a little bit about that, is that you can't take any little thing for granted. And it's all these little things along the way that add up to who we are. And so you may say that overall, you may not have been that privileged, but it's the little things, like Fong talks about, the drinking water in your community. And it's all of these little things. It's like, if you lived in a smaller apartment because you were in there with all your family, it was hard to do your homework. And that will have an impact. Both parents are working. And so I think that sometimes people have a tendency, and I'm sure you've heard this, is to say, well, they need to try harder, or they need to, work harder. But, that's not putting yourself, I guess maybe is the most important thing is, should people try to just put themselves in other people's shoes? I mean, can they do that without knowing everything that person has experienced?
You need to have humility, right? I mean, for myself, even though I'm Latina, it doesn't mean that I speak for the entire Latina experience, right? So there's humility there. It's a mixture of, like, understanding the history and then being a really good listener, asking good questions. And when there's And one thing that, like, again, that I feel very, very lucky to do is that because I'm an entrepreneur, I don't work a lot with people who don't recognize their privilege. Like, they're repelled by me,
Mm-hmm.
So for people who do work with people who don't recognize their privilege, like if you're a financial planner and you're trying to bring more good ancestor energy into your clients and they're resistant, I would say slow down. Not push the client out or try and shame them into acting right, into, like, agreeing with your values, but slow down. And maybe this is where they need to go to therapy, or they need to go to some other place, but, like, what is it that is making them so resistant to looking at how fortunate they are?
Yeah, it's self-reflection. I love that you brought it back around to listening. as a key, but it's about your client in this situation, and maybe just what they're open to experiencing or hearing or thinking about, and recognizing in themselves. Some people are reflective and some people aren't, and there's nothing good or bad in it. It's just, is that the right client for you? And as you said with yourself, is because you're so sure of who you are that clients can self-select pretty easily, I would imagine, if they're going to work with you, because they know exactly who you are. And that's awesome. I think that's a great trait.
And another thing that brings is that when I worked in spaces where I wasn't able to be as loud about my social justice values, or the things that are about my values in general, it felt really difficult when clients were not aware of what they were saying could impact me, if that makes sense. Me as a practitioner of financial services, sometimes I remember having clients who just made decisions that were very selfish and that were not considering their community at all. And it wasn't so much about me judging them as it was about me seeing how I was being personally impacted by their decisions, and then not being able to speak up. That felt really hard. That was, again, another big reason that I decided to move into entrepreneurship, and again, to be very vocal about my values. So for any people of color listening, any women, like when you hear that stuff, when you hear a client say something that's harmful, like pause and acknowledge it, right? Pause and acknowledge it, and see where maybe you need to speak up to the client. But maybe you need to go talk to somebody else about it. Maybe you need to join Females in Finance. Maybe you need to find other people of color that are financial planning practitioners. But like, don't internalize it. It's not that there's something wrong with me that it hurt. It was just that the situation itself is hard.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Boy, we could probably talk about this for a really long time, because I think that is an issue for people, is they hear things and somebody says it, and sometimes it's intentional, but a lot of times it's not intentional. And it's like, how do you react in a situation where you are the minority? Not necessarily even in the way that we think of a minority, but as we talked about earlier, you may be the LGBTQIA person, you may be the disabled person, you may be the Latina. There's lots of ways you can be a minority. And so it's like, people are not sensitive to that. And, they say things. So, just in the interest of wrapping up, boy, we could do a whole nother episode. Maybe I could have you and Fong on together. That'd be awesome. So to wrap up, this is what I ask everybody is, what is your number one tip on financial wellness?
My number one tip on financial wellness, if we talked about a lot of them, right? Understanding your values, understanding your beliefs. I think those are the top ones. Like, understand your values and make sure that they're reflected in your cash flow and your spending plan. Like, go back to your spending plan and make sure that the 5 top things you value are reflected on there, that you're prioritizing them.
That's awesome. That's great advice. And I will be putting in links to your website and your social media channels, but where is a good place? Where's the best place for people to connect with you, learn more about you and your work?
Yeah. I'm assuming that this is for the financial services industry, Twitter. I actually am really enjoying, even though like what's happening right now with Elon Musk and Twitter, what that is. But I find that I connect with a lot of other financial planning professionals on there.
And what about for consumers who are listening to this episode?
For consumers, Instagram, and then I have a newsletter. Right now I'm kind of in a little bit of a hibernation mode where I'm only sending out my newsletter once a month, but it'll go back to more frequent intervals. I haven't decided how frequent, back in January. So for consumers, I really recommend my newsletter. Awesome.
Well, Diana, it's been a pleasure to have you on today. Thanks for joining me for the podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and thank you everybody for tuning into this episode of the Tony Steuer Podcast. Until next time.
Bye.